Alright, this is Unit 3, Video 4, and in this video we're going to look at the next three presidents, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Jefferson was a longtime defender of state and individual rights. He believed in what he called a strict interpretation of the Constitution. He said if something was not explicitly written in the Constitution, then that power was not granted. His actions as president, however, were really more typical of someone who believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. The best and most well known example of Jefferson using powers that weren't listed in the Constitution was his decision to purchase the Louisiana Territory from France. The Louisiana purchase included the acquisition of almost 1 million square miles of new territory. The land was bought from France for $15 million, which was pennies on the acre. The original plan was to only buy the city of New Orleans, but Napoleon ended up selling the entire territory to the Americans. Now, the Constitution does not give the president the power to purchase territory from another country. So, by doing this, Jefferson expanded the power of the presidency and really went against his strict interpretationist approach to the Constitution. To explore this territory, he chose Lewis and Clark. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark spent about 16 months exploring the newly acquired territory. They mapped the region as well as documented new plant and animal life. They also recorded information about Native American tribes in the West. And Lewis and Clark were also actually looking for the Northwest Passage, which is a mythical water route through the North American continent, which obviously they did not find. The map on the right shows the route that Lewis and Clark took. They started in St. Louis and went up the Missouri River and then went all the way to the Pacific. This is a picture of Thomas Jefferson on the left. So the question here asks, how did the Louisiana Purchase show an expansion of presidential power with Jefferson? So in doing something that the Constitution did not grant, using a power that was not specifically listed in the Constitution, Jefferson showed that he was expanding presidential power and interpreting the Constitution really in what we would call a loose interpretation. The fourth president of the United States is James Madison. When Madison was elected, the country had some real issues with Great Britain. In 1812, Madison finally asked Congress for a declaration of war, and he gave 4 reasons for this request. Number one, it was that the British would not allow the United States, who has declared themselves as a neutral nation, they would not allow the U.S. to trade with France. So the United States said this was a violation of our rights as a neutral nation. Number two was the British practice of impressment, and that meant that U.S. sailors, just civilians, not soldiers, were being taken off of U.S. ships and forced, or the word is impressed, into service for the British Navy. The third reason Madison cited was that the U.S. was really suspect of Britain supplying Native Americans with weapons to continue fighting against the United States, specifically in the Great Lakes region. And then the fourth, the U.S. wanted to drive the British from Canada. They wanted to conquer all of North America. And so for those 4 reasons, the United States went to war with Great Britain in 1812. Now, the U.S. didn't have any major military victories while the war was actually going on. They had the Battle of New Orleans just after the war had ended, but they didn't lose any territory to the British either. The fact that the U.S. stood up to, again, the most powerful force in Europe brought a lot of national pride to the United States. Because the British blockaded the American coast, the U.S. manufacturing had to pick up in the country, and it did. And the idea began to emerge after the War of 1812 that the United States was not just this experiment in self-government, as many had called it with the Declaration of Independence, but it was in fact a strong and viable country. This is a picture of Madison on the left, or painting rather, and on the right you have a depiction of the British marching into Washington, D.C. They set fire to the White House, the Capitol building, and many other buildings in D.C. During the War of 1812. The last president we're going to look at here is James Monroe. Monroe easily won the 1816 election because of this national unity and pride following the War of 1812. This time is called the era of good feelings in the country. The most famous and lasting policy that we have from Monroe's presidency was called the Monroe Doctrine. This is an important term that you'll need to make sure that you know. When a group of European countries planned to work together and try and recapture many of the colonies that they had lost in the Western Hemisphere through other revolutions, the Monroe Doctrine announced that the U.S. would stop such attempts. So this is 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. That's it. We're a 50-year-old nation, and we're telling Europe not to try and come to the Western Hemisphere and recapture colonies. It was quite a statement for the U.S., especially in that time period. It also said that the U.S. would remain neutral in European wars and that we would not interfere in Europe's American colonies. So if they already had colonies here, we would not interfere and we would not get involved in European wars. And that foreign policy is really going to last for the next about 100 years in the country. On the left, you can see a picture of James Monroe, and on the right, you can see a political cartoon of the Monroe Doctrine. You can see Uncle Sam here on the Western Hemisphere with his hat over it, kind of showing that he's protecting it, and all the leaders in Europe looking on at the Western Hemisphere. So some questions here that you have for the end of this unit. How the War of 1812 helped develop a national identity. As we said, the U.S. doesn't really dominate this war. It's really more of a draw, but they don't lose. And because they don't lose, U.S. manufacturing had picked up during the war, and so that was on the rise, as well as national pride. So the War of 1812 showed that the U.S. could stand up to a country like Great Britain militarily. They had the might to at least stop them from advancing on the country. And it also helped the U.S. show that it had some manufacturing power and economic power as well. The period right after the war was called the Era of Good Feelings, and that was the period just after the War of 1812. The Monroe Doctrine, it really had two parts. The first part said that the U.S. would stop any European attempts to recapture colonies that they had lost in the Western Hemisphere. And on the reverse side of that, the U.S. said that they would stay out of European affairs. If things, wars in Europe happened, that the U.S. would stay out of that. So it was kind of just a neutrality for both sides. And what did the Monroe Doctrine prove about the U.S. during this time period? It showed that the U.S. was a power in the Western Hemisphere and really the world. It proved that the U.S. at least believed that they were a major power to be reckoned with in the world, and they were only, as we said, about 50 years old at that point.